Thank you. And thank you all for being here. This is just an incredible room. Look at you all. I can't begin to thank you enough for being here to celebrate President Clinton and Shirley Ryan with us. And thank you, Rob. Thank you, Rob, for that wonderful introduction. This is our 35th anniversary, and I can remember back when Access Living first thought about having a gala, there were about 45 people who came to our very first one out at the Arlington Park racetrack, and look where we are now. Each year, Access Living presents our Lead On Award to individuals who have significantly contributed to advancing the principles of the Americans with Disabilities Act: inclusion, independence, and empowerment. The award is named in honor of my dear friend, the late Justin Dart Jr., known as the father of the ADA, who was beloved by the disability community and who ended every speech by saying, "Colleagues, together we have overcome, together we shall overcome. Lead on." There is no one more deserving of the Lead On Award than President William Jefferson Clinton. As a trusted friend and advisor to President Clinton, Justin would be so honored to know that the President is receiving the award that carries his name. In fact, before he passed away, Justin said, "Mr. President, we, the people with disabilities, our families, and our advocates, thank you for your historic contributions to the quality of our lives and to our democracy. You have dramatically advanced the empowerment of people with disabilities, creating a model that the future will not be able to ignore." This afternoon, I spoke to Justin's widow, Yoshiko Dart, and she asked me to extend her deepest love and honor to you, President Clinton. She wishes she could be here and wants you to know that this is a proud moment for her, and she knows that it would be so for Justin as well. President Clinton understands that disability rights are civil rights. During his presidency, he took seriously the paradigm shift that the law requires. Disability is a normal part of the human condition, and the world has to change a little to let us in. He knew that the promise of this great law would only be fulfilled with vigorous enforcement and policy reform throughout his administration, and he had an intuitive grasp of the disability community slogan, "Nothing about us without us." As a result, he appointed an unprecedented number of people with disabilities throughout his administration. We were everywhere, from the State Department and the White House to the Social Security Administration, HHS, the Department of Transportation, HUD, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Education. He raised the bar for all future administrations. He learned from us and opened the White House to meet with representatives from the disability community more than any president ever in history. He listened when we told him enforcement of the ADA and other civil rights laws were our #1 priority. Indeed, perhaps one of his most lasting legacies was his administration's vigorous enforcement of the ADA itself. Attorney General Janet Reno and Assistant Attorney General Deval Patrick were charged by him with its full implementation using all the tools of the ADA. From strong regulations, voluntary compliance and mediation programs, to action with the courts, their work laid the foundation for making the meaningful changes in the everyday lives of people with disabilities for generations to come. What we have come to view as commonplace, such as curb cuts, accessible buses, trains, and subways, sign language interpreters at public events, a 911 system that is accessible to people who are deaf, accessible ATM machines, service animals accompanying blind people in airports, restaurants, and at the workplace, are all freedoms achieved because of the ADA and because of the President's enforcement of it. An active court program, yeah. An active court program ensured that the ADA was interpreted expansively, defending the constitutionality of the ADA and seeking broad interpretations of its provisions to ensure, for example, that people with HIV are covered by the ADA and that people with the disabilities have a right to live in the community rather than in institutions. Make no mistake, these things did not just happen because the law was on the books. They happened because of the President's leadership and vision for an America that provided real equality and opportunity for all. That vision caused President Clinton to go well beyond the ADA in implementing policy reform and innovations throughout federal government. He expanded educational opportunities for children and youth with disabilities by strengthening the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and opposing weakening amendments that would have excluded thousands of students. He preserved Social Security and made important changes to the SSDI program to remove some of the work disincentives. He expanded the availability of accessibility of technology and authored many initiatives to make healthcare more accessible and responsive to the needs of people with disabilities, including the initial pilot program to get people out of institutions by investing in community-based services. His work paved the way to the historic Olmsted Supreme Court decision, which is finally being implemented here in Illinois. And most importantly, the President understood that real equality requires fair participation in the workplace. Through numerous initiatives, executive orders, budget allocations, and enforcement actions, he tackled head-on the unconscionable unemployment of people with disabilities, committing to hiring 100,000 workers in the federal government. While that work is far from over and is the subject of our ADA 25 legacy projects, President Clinton understood that to make all of these changes, especially in the area of employment, it would take a village. Thank you, Hillary. And all of us working together to make this a common goal. I had the great privilege of working as the chair of the National Council of Disability under President Clinton, and I can't tell you how honored I was to serve in that capacity. So please, would you all join me as I present the Lead-On Award to President William Jefferson Clinton. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first, I want to thank Marca for the award, for her leadership of Access Living, for her stunning leadership of the National Council on Disabilities during my presidency, and for proving here with that introduction the enduring truth of Clinton's third law of politics, which is whenever possible, be introduced by someone you have appointed to a good job. They will airbrush your flaws and amplify your virtues. It's wonderful. I want to thank Shirley Ryan, who's being honored tonight, for her long service with Pathways and for her service on the Council on Disabilities, both under the first President Bush and when I was president. Ron Gidwitz, thank you for your work. Kareem Dale, thank you for your involvement and your previous service in Washington. And to the staff and volunteers, I thank them for all the good things they've done and will do. I'm honored that Attorney General Madigan's here, and we'll try to give her no cause to bring any action against me tonight. And you know, Mayor Emanuel, the longer he goes on, the better he gets at making fun of me. He was really good tonight. And I told him he should consider adopting that whole speaking style on a permanent basis. And he said that he couldn't afford to do it because if he spoke that slow, it would cut down on the number of epithets he could produce per minute. I'm just kidding. I am really proud of him, and I think he's a great mayor for you. We have talked a lot about already about why you decided to give me this award. I am profoundly honored. I loved Justin Dart. And I'm still in regular contact with Yoshiko, and I miss him all the time. I should have worn my cowboy boots in his honor. Those of you who know him knew that he never wheeled out of the house without having his cowboy hat and his boots on every single day. I learned a lot from him, and he was the embodiment of what always struck me about the disability rights movement and the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement. Anybody who's against these things doesn't know enough stories. When I was 5 years old, my family moved into a little white house on a corner in Hope, Arkansas, in the middle of one of these little post-World War II developments of little white houses. And across the street, there was another family. There was a daughter who was a year older than me named Mitzi Polk, who was taller than I was and bigger than I was, who was what we would now say developmentally disabled. She was, however, not disabled when it came to her sense of humor. Her favorite activity was to get in a swing every day and swing up and down, screaming at the top of her lungs that I sucked a bottle. A practice I had abandoned 3 years earlier. I thought my entire sense of honor and young manhood was threatened at age 5 or 6 whenever Mitzi started in on me. 50 years later, she was still at it, living in an assisted living center, doing various community work. I maintained my relationship with her and her mother for 50 years. So when the Americans with Disabilities Act came along, it seemed second nature to me. When I was governor, I had two people who happened not to be able to see who were working in the governor's office. One of them, Barbara Duncan, was the best caseworker I ever met in my life. She could have defeated me if she'd filed for governor. And it was her experience that convinced me to establish the first casework office in the White House. He said, "Oh, that's not a president's job." I said, "I know, but look how many thousands of letters we get a year from somebody's grandfather who never got the medal that he earned in World War II to someone who couldn't get disability." When I was governor, there were some abuses in the disability benefits program, but as government often tends to do, they go too far from one direction into the other. And under the Reagan administration, there were some rules proposed that were simply too harsh. And people who were in desperate trouble were being cut off of disability benefits. There was, I'm not making this up, there was a truck driver with a 9th grade education from the little rural county where the Clintons were originally from, who lost an arm in an accident, and they said he wasn't eligible for disability because he could get a desk job as an office worker. And there were thousands of stories like that. So I was trying to persuade the Congress as a young governor to fix it. And we had to pass this resolution through the governor's conference, and coming at the end, you had to have 75% of the committee and 75% of the governors, which meant it had to be bipartisan. And I was one vote short in this committee that had to meet an emergency session at 7:30 in the morning. And the only way I could get my last vote was to convince a man I grew up bitterly opposing, George Wallace, who made a second round as governor with the support of a lot of African American leaders in Alabama, to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, because it took him 2 hours to get ready after he was shot and put in a wheelchair, and come to a committee hearing. And every day he was in pain, particularly when he had to get ready to go out and face the day. And I called him the day before and asked him if I could come see him, and I explained the problem. He said, "Yeah, I know all about this disability law. When do you need me?" I said, "Somewhere between 7 and 7:15. He said, "I'll be there." And I knew from his wife that it took him 2 hours to get ready. And he was there, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, on time, providing the decisive vote. 60 days later, the Congress changed the rules, the president signed them, and decent treatment to huge numbers of disabled people was restored. You don't want to give up on anybody, and you don't want to forget the stories. When I ran for governor, New Hampshire has 10 counties. Ron was there. We had to do well in New Hampshire. And it was hard because one of my opponents lived 5 miles from the New Hampshire border. I could have done without that, as we say at home. But New Hampshire only has 10 counties. And as it happened, one of them had a Democratic Party chair who'd been my friend for 24 years, who was from Arkansas. She was a school teacher. One of her students was named Michael Morrison. And he came to a rally for me, wheeling a little poster, handheld, long paper banner, really. But he was the only one in a wheelchair. He was the son of a single mother who struggled as hard as she could to give him a decent life. The primary election in February of 1992 in New Hampshire was very cold and icy on the road. And Michael Morrison's mother had promised to take him to work a polling place for me 2 miles from their home. Their car broke down, and she did not have the money to fix the car. So on a cold New England morning, on an icy road, Michael Morrison got up, dressed, and took his automated wheelchair down the side of the road for 2 miles to get that polling place to do what he promised to do. I don't see disability, I see ability. Still now, 23 years later, you would be shocked at the number of mornings I wake up and think about that boy with his mother with tears in her eyes, so proud of him, motoring down the side of a state highway, hoping to God nobody hit him in a sliding vehicle. The disability community waited a long time for the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we had the honor of trying to implement a lot of it. Your great champion, Tom Harkin, has just left the Senate, one of the finest men I ever knew and one of the ablest public servants. Marca, Tony Coelho, Justin Dart, there were lots of people there pushing in the right direction. And President George H.W. Bush deserves credit. He had his heart in it when he signed that law. He believed in it. And he was always proud of it. And so we had the honor of trying to implement it, figure out what it meant, what it covered. We had to go to court to get people with AIDS covered, do you remember? Or HIV. We had to go to court to get people with mental disabilities covered. And then we passed that Ticket to Work bill, which I was especially proud of because I kept thinking, why didn't we always cover disabled workers with Medicare and Medicaid? If you took a part-time job and you made $20,000 and you had a $100,000 a year Medicaid bill, once you made the 20 grand, at least you were kicking something in to the tax coffers, which you weren't doing otherwise. This whole thing was crazy that we never did it before. But I think over the long run, that bill may have had more impact than anything else we did for people with disabilities, just by simply saying you can go to work without being sick, that you're going to lose your health care coverage. But what drove me was another story. 1993, the late Peter Jennings asked me if we would do in the White House a town hall meeting with kids. And Ron probably remembers, I think we did it on a Saturday. But anyway, we did this town hall meeting. And all these young children were there, and they were asking me questions. One of them was in a wheelchair with a relatively mild case of cerebral palsy. And she was beautiful and articulate. Her name was Anastasia Somoza. I never will forget it. And she was Nicaraguan. She had a mom and dad and a brother and a twin sister also born with cerebral palsy. So she asked me a question no one had ever asked me before. She said, now my twin sister has cerebral palsy too. But unlike me, she can't speak, so she has to talk through an electronic box in her wheelchair. And her movements aren't quite as good as mine, but her brain is, and the law says she should be able to go to public schools. So I have a specific question. Will you get my sister into public school with me? It's one of those moments which happens to you. What do you expect me to do? I'm just the president, right? I hadn't a clue. Eventually we did. And Anastasia and Alba Somoza graduated from high school. And both went to college. Alba, though she couldn't speak and could barely move, became an artist with computer-generated work that is fascinating to me. And you might be voting for Anastasia someday. I'll never forget it. A week ago, I got a letter from a young woman named Kristen Hopper. I met her 19 years ago when she was part of the signing of the Kennedy-Kassebaum bill. You know, it said if you could change jobs and keep your health insurance from job to job. And she had what is commonly known as brittle bone disease. She was one of 3 children that have affected my life with brittle bone disease, one of whom I didn't know. I'll explain to you in a minute at the time. One was a young woman from Wisconsin named Breon Schwantes. When we had the 500-year flood in 1994, you remember that in the Mississippi River? And all these towns flooded out up and down the river. I went to Davenport, Iowa, and there was this little girl with clearly with brittle bone disease, and clearly having had a lot of breaks already. going up and down, serving food and drinks to people who were sacking these huge, heavy sandbags, clearly putting herself at risk. So I said, "What's your name?" She told me. I said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Wisconsin." I said, "How'd you get down here?" "How old are you?" 12. "How'd you get down here?" She said, "My dad brought me." I saw him. I said, "Are you comfortable with her being here?" He said, "No, but I've had to get used to it. My daughter wants to live her life." And she said our neighbors were in trouble, and we had to be there. So I kept in touch with her. She went to American University, then went home to the University of Wisconsin and graduated. So this is the letter I got from the second girl, Kristen Hopper. For the first time in 19 years. "I thought you'd be interested to know that in May I'm graduating with honors from George Mason University as the highest ranked geography major. I'm getting a cord to wear for having served as a student senator and vice president of the junior and senior class councils. I've been inducted into Phi Beta Kappa. This shows that people with disabilities can succeed if given the right opportunities. The even bigger news is that I've been accepted into George Mason Law School with a scholarship that covers most of my tuition." And along the way, by the way, she also wrote a book about George Washington and his role in westward expansion. 19 years ago, what would have happened to that child if she had just been seen as disabled instead of powerful? Why am I telling you this? Because of the third disabled child. I met, or if literally speaking, I didn't meet her, in 1998 in a little village on the Li River in a remote part of China. Her name was Jiao Chun Li. She too was 12 years old. She was less than 3 feet tall. And the village elders in her little village, when it was announced that the President of the United States was taking a boat trip, and Hillary and I were there, and we took this boat trip down the Li River. It's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. I said, "We want to stop at a village, and we want to go in and see somebody, go in their homes." They picked him, her father and mother, only they had a little tiny upstairs with a tiny bedroom, only if they promised to put their child upstairs in the bed while I was in their house. So I was dumb me, man. I was having a time of my life. I went in there, Hillary went in there, we had a great time, talked to the parents, left, we're none the wiser. A couple of years ago, I got a letter from a remarkable lady who's a college professor in Minnesota telling me that this young woman was so spurred by being shunned by her village that she decided not to live as a victim, that she became a disability rights advocate in China, had gotten herself through college, had gotten herself married. She's about so big, and her husband carries her around in a halter in front of him. He's the cutest guy you ever saw in your life. They are so in love. It is so beautiful to see. And would I see her? So about 3 years ago, I was doing something at George Washington University, and up she shows. And finally, I got to embrace this child who was kept upstairs when I was in her home in China. I say that to remind you that whenever you're advocating for something, don't forget to tell the story. A lot of the work we do in Africa, we do in the lake country and just below, and when people meet each other walking along mountain paths when there's no mobile transportation, and they say, "Hello, how are you?" You don't say, "I'm fine, how are you?" The answer translated to English is, "I see you." And you think about how long this movement languished, because people were uncomfortable acknowledging the presence. How many people do I know without sight who see more every day still than God only knows how many people that life passes by? We got a lot of work to do. This agenda of 25 for the 25th anniversary that Access Living has, the disability community here has, I hope the business people here will help. We still have not evened up the unemployment rates and the reimbursement rates and all that. We still got a lot of work to do on this. And just remember, there's a story behind every one of these things. I wish I could say at my advanced age that every hiring decision I ever made was a great one and I never made a mistake. Can't say that. But I can say that every person I hired who was supposed to be disabled turned out to have abilities beyond my wildest dreams, and I never made a mistake doing that. I can say that. So, if you want to honor the 25th anniversary of the ADA, if you want to honor the memory of the magnificent Justin Dart, and if you want to honor the efforts you have already made, keep going, because there's still a lot of stories that can be even better. God bless you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for being here, for those great words as always, and it's wonderful to have you here in Chicago.